In our last episode, we saw how two great world religions, Christianity and Islam, spread across the planet. We watched as Muslim scholars preserved ancient knowledge and passed it on to the world, and we saw how Christian cathedrals reached towards the heavens. Now it's time to turn back to Europe. As we leave the Roman Empire behind, it's easy to think nothing important will come after it, but you know better than that. You've learned so much on this journey through history. Remember, every ending is also a beginning. Welcome to Turning Points of History. In the last episode, we left off with the Western Roman Empire collapsing. But wait, don't get too scared just yet. Yes, the empire fell, but its absence left space for something new to grow in Europe. That's right, no endings, only beginnings. So let's go back to Europe in the year 500 AD and find out what happens next. The first thing you would notice if you traveled back to this time would be how empty the countryside seemed. Large parts of Europe were empty and depopulated because of wars, disease, and decline. So instead of large cities, small villages grew up around castles and churches. People lived in small houses made of wood. They farmed the land and followed their local lord to war if needed. But life wasn't entirely bad. It was hard, sure, but the church taught people about God and how to live good lives. This was a time when strong beliefs were very important, and people found strength in faith. The lord of the region would live in a large house or castle, and the villagers would pay him taxes and work his fields. The villagers would also protect him and his family if the area was attacked, and in return he would protect them. This type of relationship between lords and villagers is called feudalism. Everyone had their place in medieval society and everything worked because people knew their duties. And who were these brave warriors ready to fight at a moment's notice? That's right, knights. Knights were trained from a young age. At around the age of 7, they would be sent to another noble's court to learn how to behave. Then, at around the age of 21, they would become squires, assisting a more experienced knight. They learned how to ride a horse and use weapons. By the age of 25, they were ready to become knights themselves. To be a knight, you had to follow a strict code of conduct known as chivalry. Chivalry demanded that knights were brave, loyal, and polite. They had to protect the weak and show respect to women. Of course, not all knights were honorable, but that's what they were supposed to be. Knights were heroes of the Middle Ages. They fought for their lord, their lands, and their king. They were expected to defend the honor of their family and protect their home. If they had to fight in battle, they pledged to stand by their lord's side no matter what. To become a powerful force on the battlefield, many knights joined forces to form an army. Together, they could defeat larger groups of enemies. Castles were more than just a home for the wealthy. They were fortresses designed to withstand attacks and keep their owners safe. Building a castle was a big project that could take years. They were built from stone and often had tall towers and thick walls. Some castles were surrounded by deep water-filled ditches called moats. This made it hard for enemies to attack because they couldn't get close enough to the castle. People working on a castle had important jobs. There were builders, carpenters, blacksmiths, and soldiers. These people lived and worked together until the castle was finished. Once completed, castles became symbols of power and wealth. Their large size and strong defenses impressed people for centuries. But remember, not everyone lived in a castle. Most Europeans were peasants and lived simple lives working the land. Their days were spent plowing fields and taking care of animals. Life for a peasant was tough, but they had strong communities and shared traditions. While there were wars and troubles throughout Europe, learning and knowledge did not disappear. Even though many books were lost during this time, monks in monasteries made copies of old books. This helped keep knowledge alive and made sure important writings didn't get forgotten. Many people thought the world was getting worse, but the monks saw things differently. They believed darkness could be overcome with the light of learning. Across Europe, men and women who wanted to learn gathered together to discuss ideas. They talked about philosophy, law, and medicine. What we now call universities started in Europe in the 12th century. Back then, these were called studia or schools for higher learning. The word university came later. Students would travel from all over to study at these schools. They discussed ideas and learned from each other. Over time, these schools became famous for their great teachers and beautiful buildings. Two of the earliest and greatest were Oxford in England and Paris in France. At these schools, students and teachers talked and wrote about many subjects. Philosophy, theology, and law were popular. Medicine and surgery were also studied. They also studied poetry and literature. Overall, life in medieval Europe was difficult, but there were moments of brilliance. It was a time of brave knights, huge castles, and people who loved learning. During the Middle Ages, European society was heavily influenced by religion. The Catholic Church had a lot of power and was involved in many aspects of people's lives. The Pope was the leader of the church and was considered to be the representative of God on earth. Below the Pope were bishops who led groups of priests in different areas. The church had a big impact on how people lived, especially in rural areas. Parish priests were responsible for teaching Christianity and performing religious ceremonies. Monasteries were important places where monks lived and worked. Monks dedicated their lives to God. They prayed, copied books, and helped people in need. Friars were another important part of the church. They traveled and preached to ordinary people. During the Middle Ages, people believed that the world was divided into Christians, Muslims, and those without God. For Christians, it was a time when huge cathedrals were built. They became centers of daily life. The architecture of churches and cathedrals was impressive. Gothic cathedrals were famous for their pointed arches and tall towers. The stained glass windows told stories from the Bible. The goal was to create a building that reached towards heaven. Inside these grand structures, people could connect with God and their community. Religious orders played an important role in society. Different orders focused on various tasks such as helping the poor, caring for the sick, and educating children. For example, Benedictine monks managed schools and copied manuscripts. Franciscans cared for the sick and Dominicans fought against heresy. The church also had its own courts to deal with religious matters. These courts dealt with issues related to the church and religious teachings. Members of the clergy were usually in charge of these courts. Now let's test your knowledge with some facts and figures from the Middle Ages. How long did the Middle Ages last? Well, historians say it lasted from around the year 500 to 1500 CE. Do you know how long a knight trained to become a warrior? They started training from the age of 7 and became squires at around 21. By the age of 25, they were ready to become full knights. Lastly, when did Europe's first universities appear? They started to emerge by the 12th century. The Middle Ages might seem like a time of darkness and violence, but we can also find reasons to hope and be inspired by this era. Despite wars and troubles, people still valued learning and knowledge. They understood that education is crucial for the progress of any civilization. So here are 3 lessons from the Middle Ages for today. Lesson 1. Even in the darkest of times, knowledge is precious and must be protected. Lesson 2. Strong communities and a sense of loyalty and faith can help civilizations survive difficult periods. Lesson 3. Education is the light that guides us through difficult times and helps us build a better future. The Middle Ages were an exciting and complex period in history. It was a time of faith, castles, and learning. In our next episode, we will witness the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and discovery. So join us again next time to continue our journey through history.